Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
I think those three groups within most businesses tend to put the brakes or at least slow down IoT adoption, because a lot of people are looking around trying to figure out what stance is the government going to take? What sort of liability will an IoT deployment expose us to? What kind of risk is the business taking by investing in this? And I almost feel like in industry, there's this huge game of chicken where everybody's kind of looking around at everybody else and waiting for someone to jump.
The more I dig into it, the more I'm convinced that privacy is a bigger issue than security in IoT. Now, don't get me wrong, the challenges facing IoT security are huge, and in many cases they're unchartered, but we'll figure them out. Why? Because we're good at figuring out tech. What's going to be more challenging is going to be teasing out the rules of engagement from the tangled web of IoT privacy. Because this involves people, companies, special interests, and the law. Much more difficult and with huge business implications. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with privacy philosopher Justin Klein Keane about the challenges we face and some mental frameworks in which to consider them.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com. With me today on episode 33 is Justin Klein Keane. Justin is security architect at ThingWorx, which is now part of PTC. He has over 20 years of information security experience and holds a master's degree in computers and information technology from the University of Pennsylvania. Justin is a trained programmer and as such approaches security from a developer's perspective. Now, Justin wrote me a thoughtful note on my past podcast on security and privacy, and he had a few things to say, including not giving the guests a pass on how IoT security and privacy is unique. So I thought I'd have him on the show. That's how you do it. Justin, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
So what's on the docket this week? What's the big hills you're climbing?
I think they're pretty much the same hills that I'm climbing every day.
Yeah. Okay.
I've been working in IoT security specifically for about 6 months, so I'm relatively new to this space as a full-time endeavor. But in those 6 months, I've been sort of applying the training and lessons that I've learned over the last 20 years. And really trying to get a handle on what makes IoT security so different. And right. I think what I've discovered over the last 6 months of really intense investigation is that there's a whole lot of questions and there aren't very many good answers in the field. I think there's a lot of differentiators that make IoT fundamentally different in terms of paradigm and challenge from a lot of other traditional security and information security enterprises. And I have really been shocked by the dearth of sort of guidance and best practice and design paradigms and models available for IoT. And I've observed the effects of that at work. Just with developers coming to me with security-related questions, and they're coming to me because they're not finding answers anywhere.
Right.
And I think I'm having the exact same experience. So I think this is it's a really exciting field, but I also think the fact that it's so new, combined with the fact that it has so many unique aspects, really makes it incredibly challenging from a security perspective. So every day I wake up and try and find answers, and feel like I found a few, but I still have more questions, for sure.
You're uncovering the answers on a daily basis. Is that what you're saying?
I'd like to say that. I'd say I maybe hit on an answer once a month. I think I come up with, the short-term solutions a lot of times.
Right.
The greater sort of architectural challenges, I think those are really going to be tough nuts to crack.
Yeah, and I don't know if this gets too philosophical, but are there ever any answers with security and privacy?
I'm not sure that you could say there's any hard and firm answer. I think what you can come up with is principles and best practices, so that at least you can sort of approach a problem space with a framework. Sort of, say like, well, I'm dealing with a problem of this classification. These are the typical things I should consider.
Right.
And I don't even think we have that for IoT.
No, and like we were talking about before we hit the record button, it's a work in progress, right? And it's still very early in the evolution of it. And so, well, that's kind of part of the point of this podcast too, is to kind of work through these issues all together, to a certain extent. Yeah, well, why don't you start by telling our audience a little bit about yourself, and specifically, it sounds like it's been relatively new, but your background in IoT.
So I started working for my current company, ThingWorx, which is a PTC company, about 6 months ago. And I should say that my opinions here are just my own, and they're not those of PTC or ThingWorx.
All right.
And so I came to IoT after about 10 years working security in academia while I was getting my master's degree. And I did a lot of work with sort of application security and system and network security, and was really looking forward to the challenge of IoT security. I think as soon as I started, I realized that I sort of jumped into the deep end without even realizing it. That there was a lot to untangle. And information security is a fairly new field. I think computer science is a relatively new field, and computer security is sort of the bastard stepchild that's even younger. But we do have a few decades of experiences to draw on in information security. And I was really intrigued that a lot of the lessons that we've learned in sort of those decades in traditional information security make very poor fits for IoT. And that there were sort of some engineering lessons learned from very disparate fields that wouldn't seem to map one-to-one to IoT, but actually did provide some really useful insights. And so sort of realizing that a lot of the traditional knowledge that I thought I would rely on wasn't particularly useful.
Interesting.
And a lot of the stuff that I didn't think would be useful ended up being incredibly useful, has really sort of driven me to dig into IoT security. And I've gotten involved in a couple sort of, working groups and committees, trying to seek out peers. And I think a lot of people in IoT are doing that. They're just trying to find the other people working in the problem space, figuring out, who's learning what lessons and trying to share those lessons so that we can sort of build collaboratively and achieve greater success.
So where are some of those areas specifically where you're finding your peers?
So I'm part of the Build It Securely group, which is an interesting sort of all volunteer group. It's mainly made up of traditional penetration testers and sort of new IoT businesses. And the idea is to pair up the pen testers with the IoT businesses to try and spot problems early on. I've just recently joined the Industrial Internet Consortium as part of the security working group. So working with those folks, which is really good. And I've also been talking with the OWASP IoT project folks about opportunities there.
Right.
So, but even just finding those resources, I think, has been incredibly difficult. I think in most other areas of security, the communities are much better established, much more apparent. It's very easy when you break into a new industry to identify, these are the security resources, this is the security community, these are the folks to talk to get expertise. And with IoT, you really don't seem to have that yet.
Yeah, no, well, and you've helped out our audience. I mean, we've obviously spoken with Daniel from OWASP, the IoT component of OWASP, and we've also had a podcast with IIC, which I think very highly of. But the Build It Security group, that's a new one to me, and probably a lot of people in the audience. So thanks for that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I already know one kind of interesting thing about you. We kind of talked about that, but why don't you share? I don't know if you're going to share that or share something different. But I always ask my guests, what's an interesting thing that most people would not know about you?
So yeah, I thought about this a lot, and I live a lot of my life online, just being involved in
Mm-hmm.
computers. So most of my life is pretty open and apparent. But I think what most people don't realize is I actually have a master's degree in U.S. colonial history.
Ah, interesting.
So
Okay.
yeah, so
Well, you mentioned 10 years of academia, and then you mentioned your degree, and I didn't want to ask, but the two didn't seem to compute. But it seems like this kind of fits into it then.
yeah. Well, I'm a part of the whole generation of cast-off liberal arts majors who got sucked up in the dot-com boom. Um, I feel like we should have a moniker.
Yeah. Well, I think this is your chance. So, what was the degree in again?
U.S. colonial history. So
U.S. colonial history. That is something that okay, and so you left the U.S. colonial history track and moved on to the security information security track.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And then what brought about that change?
Oh well, I couldn't get a job. So
Okay, there is that. There is that. Yeah, I've been trying to convince. So my daughter just graduated from high school. Well, just last year, so she's starting college this year, and I've been trying to convince her on data science. Because data science that's the crap right there.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who has a degree in data science, they are going to be able to basically write their ticket, because specifically with IoT, it's just so important. I just can't get her into it, though.
Yeah.
I just can't get her interested into it. So,
I don't.
it's not always about the job, but you got to hopefully try to find, this fit where it seems like you're very passionate about security. So it's nice that you've been able to find that fit with. Definitely, there's a huge demand on the security side as well.
Yeah.
Plus, plus it's something you find interesting, right?
Well, and I think too, there's certainly an argument to be made for gaining job skills in a college degree. But I think one of the things that's made me so successful with information security was studying liberal arts and learning about philosophy and literature, and just sort of being able to think critically and abstractly and sort of apply different models to different problems. And I honestly, I don't know if I had gotten an engineering degree if I would have been quite as prepared to step into those kinds of situations. I think with a straight up computer science or engineering degree, you can provide the right answers to specific questions, but then when you come to sort of obtuse problems that don't have clear answers, I think you might be a little bit less prepared. So I don't know. I don't want to discourage any of those philosophy majors who think they won't find work.
No. In fact, I think, going, I'm facing this right now with my daughter, and since it's her first year, she doesn't have to decide yet. But I think philosophy rocks. I mean, for myself, and it wasn't intentional. It just sort of happened this way. But my degree is in science, but it's in mathematics, and I would say that's the counter. That's the counter to philosophy, in the sense of logic. And like you say, it's not specific problems; it's more thinking in a certain way. But I think philosophy, when you dig into it just a little bit, the logic and the solidity of that type of thinking, I think is very applicable. So that's in fact. When she's still, I don't know what to do, that's one of the areas I'm saying, take some philosophy classes if you're going to go in that direction, because like you said, I think it's just such a strong base for pretty much anything, pretty much anything you decide to do. Yeah. All right, well, let's jump into it. We talked, and in fact, by the time this episode comes out, we'll have had our episode with Paul, but I like to talk and get your take on security by design. I mean, I think a lot of people hear it. The words come out. In fact, I was just at an IoT security conference in Boston a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, and that was, the major buzzword. But I'd like you to give us your perspective on what does that mean exactly.
Well, I think security by design as a principle is something that the community's really been struggling to define for a while. Building security in, is sort of a movement led by folks like Gary McGraw and Cigital. And I think they've had a lot of success in application design. I think as we abstract it out towards IoT, it becomes a little bit trickier. So the idea of security by design is basically to involve security personnel, trained engineers and architects, at the inception of a project, and to keep them involved throughout the full life cycle of the project, including, sort of ongoing maintenance. And traditionally, you want a lot of focus on things like threat modeling and risk assessment, sort of very high-level abstract assessments of the project and the various security challenges that you're going to face. I think where that becomes difficult with IoT is most IoT deployments are a full stack deployment, meaning that they involve hardware, software, networking, operating systems, all of these components that traditionally security has addressed in isolation.
Right.
And we're building them all up together. And not only that, but we're interconnecting them. And we're using a completely heterogeneous makeup of a system. So you're not even dealing with sort of a standard build. So you've got all of these different components that go into making an IoT system. And understanding the security implications of all of those interactions is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And, I think part of the problem with sort of building an IoT security system or IoT system with security by design is that in a lot of traditional sort of security by design processes, you have certain fundamental principles that you can fall back on. Building secure defaults, defense in depth, sort of a protect, detect, react cycle of development, fault tolerance, all of these things. There really aren't very many good guidelines for IoT deployments. You can't look at this top 10 checklist of, these are the things I need to think about in my IoT system. Because I think if you decompose your IoT system, you're going to find that there's going to be dozens, if not hundreds, of individual components. And each of those might have, a top 10 list of things to consider. But the interaction of all of those parts together is next to impossible, really, to sort of understand in terms of the security implications once things get up and functioning. So I think the best thing that we can do with secure design vis-a-vis IoT is really make sure that you have the appropriate people involved in the project, that you have security architects and security engineers. So senior people who have experience developing systems and seeing how they go sideways, who can just sort of sit in on conversations about the projects that you're thinking about and developing, and really just sort of noodle on them and point out areas of traditional risk, and constantly do, sort of threat assessments and, revisions of plans and look for areas of weakness, and to really kind of approach the system from beginning to end, from an architecture perspective all the way to the end result pen test perspective. And, it's sort of a maximum in the information security field that there aren't enough people. And I think what exacerbates the situation with IoT is the population of people that you can call on to fill those roles is even smaller.
Right. Well, you bring up 3 points. Point number 1, maybe I should try to convince my daughter on IoT security. So that would be point number 1. Point number 2, related to that, is getting the appropriate people involved. And I think that's a good point, specifically when you're within an organization. If you're a startup, and even if you're a larger company, you don't necessarily have those skills. So go out of house. You need to bring them in. I mean, even if it's using the 80-20 rule, where you maybe don't have a huge budget, but just at least have the high level overview of people that do have the experience, because they're out there and they're for hire. They're just not necessarily within your organization. And I think, but the most important point, I think, is the operative word of system. And you've brought that up, but that is really the difference, right? I mean, in the sense that you're having to look at it from a system point of view. So in addition to the app, the mobile, the cloud, the network security, which all work very nicely, which have a history that you can fall back on, but it's the interplay between them. It's the assumptions maybe that the architect is making between the different systems, where you really, it's an IoT system security. You're having to look at it there. So maybe, would you think that maybe just system design in general may be a very good area to look upon, and maybe there's some lessons to be learned there? Wouldn't there be?
One would hope.
Okay.
I think the composition of most IoT deployments is different enough, on a case-by-case basis, that even there, I think you might run into some trouble. And of course, this is, I know you hate to talk about, the security fears around IoT, because they're certainly hyped. But I really think that part of the reason that people are so nervous about IoT security is because they realize that, these systems are incredibly complex. They're evolutionarily more complex than traditional systems, like mobile or your desktop or your, operating system. And we continually have problems with those traditional systems. My laptop crashed unexpectedly this morning, and luckily it came back, but that's not unusual And, my laptop is not connected to any physical system that has any real life interaction with people, right? Like it doesn't have any actuators or, electron magnets in it or anything like that. And, so its crash is kind of a hassle. But, as soon as we start talking about taking these traditional systems, evolving them one step further, interconnecting them, providing autonomy, and then connecting them up with machines that have real world interactions with people, I think any sort of casual observer, informed or otherwise, would look at that and say, wow, that's really error prone. Lots of bad things can happen here. And the consequences could be a lot more grave than a crashing laptop. So, it's unfortunate that there is so much fear around IoT security, but I think it's somewhat warranted. I think we're going to probably find solutions to a lot of these problems, but I don't think we can underestimate the danger that IoT system security can pose to businesses and human life eventually.
Yeah, and just to clarify my position, what I don't like is the fear mongering, and I think the point that you made is that it is evolutionary and everything evolves, and it's not like IoT deployments are out there 100% today. They're evolving and they're getting more and more complex over time, and just like all these different branches of security, at least my view is it's moving at a glacial speed, even though we're our eyes are really close to it and we're looking at it and it seems like it's moving really fast, but it's not. It's not really moving that fast. And my point is, since it is evolutionary and it takes time, we're going to catch up to it. It's just going to take a bit of time. What I don't like is the fear mongering, that goes without the solution side of it. And that's what I'm trying to do in this podcast specifically. Okay, yeah, it's going to be scary, and okay, maybe it, but what do we do? What do we need to do? Because the listeners of this podcast are the folks that are going to be implementing all these different systems. And I think we're hitting on it. The first thing is looking at it as a system in terms of what are the inputs, what are the outputs, seeing what the threat vectors are at each of those. And again, like you were saying, doing a threat assessment, doing a risk analysis, because that is in the wheelhouse of the business person. And we take it piece by piece. But what I don't like is just, So I was recently moderating for the morning of the second day of an IoT conference in Berlin just last week, and the person had this great presentation on he was an operator and a great presentation. Then he leaves it with this fear, and he just leaves it hanging out there, and it's like, really? And so I just I couldn't help myself, and I just said, why did you not in these words, but why did you do that? And this is on stage. What don't you think this and that? And then he goes, well, I guess I just wanted to make it compelling. And that's my issue. I agree, Justin. It's scary, and I agree that there could be lives, at stake, and I agree that someone was able to take over, a car remotely, and I think that is definitely possible. But you see what I'm saying? I mean, that's kind of my point of view, and I don't mean to ramble on it, but I just, I get a little bit heated on that.
I think you're definitely right. I mean, I think all of the problems are surmountable. It's just a matter of identifying them.
And just getting behind them and just knowing that there are problems there. But however, I think, the counterbalance to this is that it's really weird. In IoT, the security ramifications, like you're saying, and even privacy, because we haven't been talking as much on privacy, which we will, but they're pretty large. But it seems to a certain extent that it seems to be the last priority, not only for the developers, because it's not a shiny feature, but also for the consumers. And when I say consumer, I don't just mean the home consumer, but even the commercial consumer. And so it's this dichotomy of, huge potential implication with a lack of caring on both the producer and both the buyer and the seller. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what's going to, is it going to be a big catastrophe that's going to change that? Is it going to be, I'm going to want to talk to you. In fact, that maybe is a good segue into the next question on regulation. But, is it government regulation? Is it going to be a consumer, upvote? But I don't know. First, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think is going to actually, or do you agree with me? One, that the priority seems low, and if you do, what do you think is going to raise the priority of security and privacy, in our industry? Yeah,
that's an interesting question. I think probably to answer that, we should sort of step back and recognize that, IoT is this huge, catchphrase that really pulls in a lot of different systems. And, when we talk about IoT, we're talking about, consumer IoT, we're talking about industrial, we're talking about
commercial, infrastructure,
medical. Yeah. And so, and all of these different arenas have slightly different security considerations.
Right.
And so I think
it's big.
Yeah. I think when you find, where you find consumers rushing headlong in, regardless of security implication, it's typically in the consumer IoT market.
Right.
I think if you look at sort of the industrial, manufacturing, smart city, those types of big business markets, I think there's a lot more skepticism amongst the customers, and there's a lot more security concern. And I think the reason is exactly because of regulation. I think the federal government and the FTC has been pretty quick to fine people for failure to protect data. The FTC has a white paper that they've published on their website called "Start with Security," and it's actually designed for startups. But that paper is based on 50 cases where they've fined businesses for failure to protect consumer data and information security. So I think the implications for business are big. I also think a lot of IoT manufacturers are very aware of this. I think the FTC is set to propose guidelines on IoT security. That could be a precursor for government action in the area. So I think when you find, sort of home, IoT consumers, they seem a little bit less concerned with security, although, everything that I read says that people are aware that it could be a problem. They just ignore it because they want the features. I think when you approach businesses and sort of large-scale IoT deployments, it's been my experience that those customers are a little more leery. I think they're more aware of the problem, and I also think they have security teams. And when they approach their own internal security teams about potential IoT deployments, their security teams sort of throw up red flags and say, hey, that could have really serious business impact. We need to talk about it. I also think companies, their legal and compliance departments are also very aware of the impact of IoT deployments. And so I think those three groups within most businesses tend to put the brakes or at least slow down IoT adoption. Because a lot of people are looking around trying to figure out what stance is the government going to take? What sort of liability will an IoT deployment expose us to? What kind of risk is the business taking by investing in this? And I almost feel like in industry, there's this huge game of chicken where everybody's kind of looking around at everybody else and waiting for someone to jump. But there aren't really any good guidelines. There aren't any front runners. And there's nobody just sort of charging full speed ahead saying, damn the torpedoes, because I think they recognize that, for a business, there could be really severe impacts in a poorly thought of IoT deployment.
Yeah, they're chicken in that game, which is probably rightly so. But I would also maybe just, expand a little bit. What you're saying is it depends on the company. I work, I advise a number of companies, and one of them is a third generation company that is the opposite of technology. They don't have compliance officers. They made a physical product, and now we're moving it and we're making an IoT version of that. They don't even know what security is. I mean, they've got an IT guy. I mean, they're still like probably a $500 million company. However, their IT guy is their security guy. And, and so it points to, what you're saying, the lack of resources. But, I want to ask you, specifically about regulation.
Sure.
One of the points that you brought up to me was on this. So, is IoT privacy being regulated today? I mean, is it really being regulated? Because, we've heard slightly different points of view in previous podcasts.
I think the answer is not concretely. I think
that's a wishy-washy answer.
Well, and it's a wishy-washy field. I think you see some federal agencies that are attempting to regulate IoT with respect to basically fining companies or finding them at fault.
Like the FTC, you're saying? Because I was surprised. I didn't realize that they'd actually been that. I knew about. I think we've mentioned that white paper before, but you said it was based on like 100 different fines that they've done. So
I think it's 50 that they.
50. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But, you know,
So,
it's not
okay.
just them. You know, you'll see the FCC will occasionally step in and
Really?
fine people for not handling consumer, you know, privacy data properly. You know, the other big one that a lot of people don't think about is the FDA. So any medical IoT deployment is going to go through an FDA approval process that's going to be incredibly rigorous and incredibly lengthy. And actually, I think medical device manufacturers probably have a lot of lessons to teach many IoT companies, just because they've been dealing with very aggressive regulation for a really long time. And one of the challenges that they identified very early on is it's hard to make improvements on systems after they're deployed. And so they really have to build sort of almost what I'd call like forward compatible security, which is something that I think everybody should be thinking about. You know, I think, you know, a lot of people look at IoT and they sort of think, oh, well, you know, these are kind of disposable devices and we'll just throw them out in the field. But I think in reality, a lot of IoT deployments could probably learn a lot from NASA. You know, you're basically building machine connected systems that, for all intents and purposes, you're launching into space. You know, you're going to deploy these out in the field. They're going to be in a hostile environment. You're not going to be able to recall them, touch them, update them. You know, I mean, unless you're willing to, you know, mail out thousands of USB keys to all of your customers to update them. And, you know, I think even if you look back at the issues that Wink had, you can clearly see the challenges of creating the system, putting it in a hostile environment, and then just leaving it deployed. And for the consumer IoT, the deployment cycle is probably less, but I know in industrial circles, it's not uncommon to deploy IoT devices for, you know, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's a really long time. And designing security that can survive over those kinds of lifespans is incredibly challenging and difficult. So,
yeah, well, and, you know, the one I'd like to touch on, I think, is maybe space. You know, that's far deployment for sure. But, you know, medical companies, I had a student in my workshop, so I often teach a one-day workshop on, you know, on building IoT businesses, and he brought up a really good point in the sense of they're building an IoT medical device, and generally the FDA will regulate that device. But then, you know, what does it mean? Because as we know, it's not a device any longer; it's a system, and part of that system is going to the cloud, right? So we've got those issues. Part of that system is where you're holding the data. You've got the different technology in terms of sensors. So like you said, you know, forward compatibility for them, they can't afford to have to I guess not regulate, but get their product approved, because it takes so many years. But it's interesting, because that's one of the biggest advantages of an IoT product, is being able to iterate on itself by looking at how it's being used. And so it's a bit of a conundrum, right? In the sense that, you know, if you look at, I certainly don't know what the answer is, but looking at just the medical device industry, where you could see IoT having huge impact, you know, on patients and their safety and how they recover afterward. But at the same time, what does it mean to be, you know, regulated by the FDA at that point? And then, you know, do you have to go every time you make a change to the, you know, over the software change to you know, the code, over the air, you know, change to the code? So I don't know. I mean, it's a tough one, right? I mean, and maybe it just points out the fact more blaringly that we're in the eye of the hurricane right now. We're right in the middle of it right now, and there's still a lot of issues to be worked through.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of hand-wringing in Washington about, you know, what's the government's role here? You know, do you regulate and run the risk of stifling innovation, or do you sort of let the commercial sector go and self-regulate with potentially negative impacts for consumers? It's a tough call, and I'm, you know, I think.
Well, in the U.S., I mean, it seems like the FTC, like you said, I mean, they're putting out guidance out there, but the unwritten byline is, if you don't do something, we're going to. But they're hoping, you know, that industry will self-regulate, but, you know, they don't want to get involved, but I think they will, just because of, you know, their mandate of protecting the consumer.
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a I don't know if that's a ball of wax, but it's certainly a ball of string that's really a tough one to tease apart. But, you know, what I really wanted to speak with you today on is the differences, you know, the differences between an IoT, an IoT security and just regular security. You've talked a little bit about it in terms of system, but I know you've got a specific take on this. What are the things that we should be looking at differently when we're looking at IoT system security?
So I honestly think that there's two main differentiators in IoT system security, and one is scale. I think most IoT deployments are just dealing with issues of scale far beyond most applications, and that scale cascades into complexity. But I also think IoT systems inherently or by design include a measure of autonomy that creates very specific issues. And I think you combine the scale and the autonomy, and you sort of look at traditional user interaction models. And those models break with IoT. So with a traditional sort of user model, you have kind of a one-to-one relationship, right? Like you plug into your computer, you launch your webmail, you start a particular application, you pick up your phone, and each sort of app or system that you're dealing with, it's this one system dealing with you, and it knows who you are. And so you sort of got this one-to-one relationship. With IoT, you could be using multiple different systems at the same time. And not only that, you could have multiple systems that are interacting with one another as you. So instead of this one-to-one model, I would actually say we have like an end-to-end model where you might have multiple users using multiple systems in multiple different ways. An IoT deployment, say like a medical device, right? That's not going to have one user. You're going to have the patient, you're going to have the nursing staff, you're going to have the doctor, you're going to have the insurance company, the hospital administration. All of those people are going to need data from that particular device, and that device is basically going to have to, sort of handle that data. And not only that, but the device might be talking to other devices, right? It might be reporting home that it's running low on certain materials and maybe needs a technician to come out and deal with it. It might be reporting to other devices of the same type. It might be uploading results to some sort of patient care management system. And so I think when you have these kinds of interactions, traditional security mechanisms like username and password just completely break down. You don't have one user authenticating to one device. You have a device that maybe is brokering transactions on behalf of a user. So how do you provide things like transitive trust to a device? Like this device can prove that John trusts it, and John trusts this external device. So should this device trust the external device too? Because trust both of them? I don't know. You've got models that, one of my favorite examples, vis-a-vis like authentication and authorization is I would love to show up at my friend's house with my bag full of, connected devices and have him be able to authorize all those devices on his network and to interact with his devices for 24 hours. That's an incredibly complex authorization model. Like we don't have any good solutions for those kinds of things. Not only that, the autonomy of IoT means that some IoT deployments are interacting with you without your knowledge. So you don't even have this sort of explicit authorization contract with the system. You might have an autonomous sensor that's collecting data about you in ways that you don't even know. This is especially true if you're not the device owner. If you just happen to come into proximity of the device, this device could be collecting personal, potentially damaging information about you, and you don't even have any opportunity to consent to the utilization of that device via, an authentication or authorization mechanism. And so, these kinds of problems become really, really thorny with IoT. One thing I like to think about is if you're thinking about security and privacy in, say, something like a tire sensor. That seems like a pretty dumb device. Like, threat model, like, who cares if somebody knows what the tire pressure in my car is? Like, I don't care. But my command of fluid dynamics is not awesome, but let's just assume that the tire pressure sensor can tell when your car is occupied. When it's moving, it can tell at what elevation it is. Well, all of a sudden now you're getting some interesting data points out of these tire sensors, and especially if you can aggregate those data points over time and correlate them with others, the tire pressure manufacturer,
such as GPS, for example.
Right. And so the manufacturer of this device may be collecting information that could allow them to determine when the car is being driven, how far it's being driven, where it's being driven, how many occupants it has. And they might be able to determine things like, the owner of this particular vehicle just had a baby, because now when they take trips, the weight of the car goes up by 12 pounds. When you're a manufacturer of a device, you would never consider that you would suddenly be a steward for data of that type and that sensitivity. It's really only once you sort of apply the advantages of big data that you discover these sorts of correlations and sort of the hidden meaning within the data. But it becomes really, really hard then to design a system that's going to protect privacy and security of people who are interacting with these tire pressure sensors when you're not even aware of the implications of the tire pressure sensor.
Well, but let's tease this out a little bit, because, and I'm just thinking this through as you're speaking, specifically for the tire pressure sensor, and you're saying it's actually correlating it maybe with other sensors too, for example, GPS, but and then you would know where they're going. You know that there's more people in the car. You could make assumptions, like you said, that they had a baby. But isn't it but there still has to be that transfer of data. This data from the tire car, or from the tire manufacturer, they're not just going to stick it as a free resources on the internet, right? So it may be consumed in different ways, but there's still going to be a relationship between the producer and the consumer. And isn't it in that relationship where some of this gets enforced? Or I don't know, am I thinking this through?
No, I think you're exactly right. I think there would be a relationship there. I think the unintended consequences would be that the tire pressure manufacturer might not protect that data with appropriate controls, because they might not realize the privacy.
Okay. So you're saying, I see what you're saying. So you're talking more not from a privacy point of view, from an integrity point of view.
Yeah, but you might also have somebody break in and steal that data, and then
that's true.
Then suddenly the correlations become obvious to everybody who's observing. I mean, I think the other thing too is, the passengers in that particular car. They didn't buy the car. They might not be aware that the sensors are there, and yet their data is being scooped up. One of the first things I thought about when sort of the Ashley Madison hack occurred was, there were a bunch of people basically saying, I live in a country where the behavior that I basically registered for on Ashley Madison could be considered illegal and could get me, persecuted, thrown in jail. Yep. And I was thinking, that's really unfortunate, and I'm not even sure Ashley Madison realized that they had that kind of data, and that they needed to protect it, commensurate with sort of the danger it posed.
Yeah, right.
And I feel like that's the situation that some IoT manufacturers might be getting themselves into without realizing it. If you're collecting data about, people perhaps in the sphere of your sensors, you don't really know what conclusion that data might lead to. And so you might be unintentionally collecting data about someone's illegal activity, or you might be collecting data from somebody who can't consent legally to the collection of their data, like a minor. If you've got, an automated camera at the front of your house, if you're taking pictures of children that are coming trick-or-treating, what's the implications of that to you as the owner? What about the company that's maybe aggregating that data in the cloud? What does that mean for them?
No, these are a lot of really good questions, but I'm trying to now, what's the solution here? So I think to all of them, it's make it more secure, so people can't break into it. They can't find the PII of whomever, whether they consented or not consented. But again, doesn't it come back to the consumption of that information, where that interface of the consumption, even though you're collecting all this data, and what you're saying, I think, is that there's unintended consequences in what you're collecting, because you may have collected it for one reason, however, it could be used in other reasons, commercially or legally, so what does that mean, though? So you are this tire manufacturer. Does it mean you don't collect the data? Does it? Doesn't it mean? You try to secure it as best as possible, and then you do a transaction. You transact with the different consumers of that data. What else is there, though? I'm trying to point this in a direction here, Justin, of what's the directional vector for a solution in this?
Right. I'm not sure I have a good answer, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's what everybody's really struggling with. I mean, part of my my perspective on the matter comes out of working in academia, where you'll have what are called IRBs, or these institutional review boards, where whenever an academic wants to start a new project or experiment, they'll have to submit that to the IRB for review. And you'll basically, in the IRB, you collect a bunch of subject matter experts, and they sort of look at the experiment and they examine, okay, what are you collecting? How are you using it? What are the rules governing the collection, dissemination, disposal of this data? Are you sufficiently de-identifying it? Could it be re-identified? What are alternative uses for this data? Like, can your subjects actually, consent to the collection of this data? Do they understand? And when I was in academia, there were a number of instances I recall where what seemed like a perfectly benign experiment ended up revealing all sorts of information completely unintentionally.
Right.
It was very, very sensitive in nature. And it was...
Yeah, and sometimes some of the biggest breakthroughs in science are again, unintended, right?
Yeah, and, so, I think IoT exposes this scale of data that just makes big data scientists salivate, and I think that's wonderful. I think we can find a lot of really great value there, but I also think we have to be really careful, because I don't think we have the equivalent of like an IRB review of these data collection activities, and I'm not sure that we're keeping a close eye on sort of the unintended consequences of this data, and it makes me even more nervous because IoT is autonomous. So the user isn't even explicitly submitting or, approving the collection of this particular data.
Yeah, specifically when there's no interface, for example.
Right. Yeah. And then there's, all sorts of other problems with, transfer of ownership and, what happens to my data once I get rid of my particular IoT deployment or device. The canonical example is a smart home. Well, I sell my smart home. What happens to all of the data and interfaces for all the connected products in my smart home? How do I transfer ownership? How do I make sure the new owner doesn't get access to my data? Make sure that I can scrub my data. These are all very new questions that are facing IoT that really didn't face any traditional security field.
Right. But I think what you're talking about, though. I mean, rules of engagement to a certain extent. These are not technical issues, right? And these are more policy issues. And I guess that maybe gets back to self-regulating versus government regulation. But when you talk about the peer reviews at the university, that was a self-regulation, or maybe they had rules that, maybe with their grant money, they had to do this. But this is also something that's smart for a university from a liability point of view, to have the peers review this, make sure you're not doing something unintentionally wrong that can put the university in trouble.
Right.
But again, I think what you're talking about the different uses of this data, and you're right, it can be used in different ways. It's being collected in ways that we're not aware of. But yes, notwithstanding it's cracked, but assuming that you're actually voluntarily having an exchange of this data, there has to be these rules of engagement of how you use this data. Isn't that covering more or less all of what you're talking about? Just the policies around the data, and more your point is just that there's still, I guess, a dearth or a lack of these policies, or what am I missing here?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think what worries me is I think a lot of IoT deployments don't take these issues into consideration. And I think maybe that's the solution, is that you have to sort of consider, well, are there unintended consequences of collecting data?
But what does it mean by taking it into consideration? What does that mean? What's the practical implications of that?
Yeah.
Other than making it more secure, I mean, but.
Yeah, maybe. I think that also might be consulting, with various groups within the organization. I mean, I think
going outside maybe
are good places to start. Yeah, but sort of thinking about, okay, if we're aggregating data, not only how are we protecting it, but, what are the rules governing access? Are we going to ever share this data? Are we going to attempt to de-anonymize this data? Should we ever destroy the data?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think you're right. No, I think that's the right perspective, and I think where you're leading this to put words in your mouth, or maybe at least my understanding of what you're saying is this is a leadership issue. This is something that has to move up the food chain. not that, IT is on the bottom of the food chain, but IT, OT, the security, this has to move up to the management level, to the leadership issue or level, so that these issues can be thought through. Because what you're saying is there's just so many ramifications, so much ramification, of what you're collecting. And what you're talking about, I think, are procedures, are like, rules, procedures and rules that the company, must take to ensure these bad things don't happen, and including potentially if or who you sell the data to. Isn't that kind of where we're leading with this thread?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that companies do that. I think in most organizational structures, though, there really isn't a dedicated person to sort of.
No, there isn't. But I think that's the point you're making, right? Is that even if there isn't a dedicated person, okay, there should be, but if there isn't, the management team, starting even with the CEO, needs to get their arms around this, because there are just some really big implications to the company, not just standing in terms of potentially safety, but looking at the balance sheet, specifically from a liability point of view, right?
Yeah, I think I think it's also a call to action for the community. I think there's been sort of a failure in community leadership in this particular space. It's and it's probably just because the community is so new and everybody's still finding answers to these questions, but.
Yeah, but I think also maybe the consistency of the community is different. When you have just these one-to-one, like you're saying, these one-to-one exchanges of value, whether it's on the app side, the mobile side, the cloud side, the network side, wherever the case may be, I think the technical community can get their hands around it. But I think what you're saying is that maybe the community needs to consist of more management, more strategic players that are thinking about maybe more lawyers. I hate to say it, but maybe there needs to be more lawyers involved, in this, and and maybe this leads us to the self-regulation, but that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, is that maybe the community is got to put more attention to this. But I'm wondering if it's the right folks that are in the community, because if it's the same community that was doing, whether they're white hat or they're black hat testing, that's a very different than what we're talking about here. We're talking about how to use this information, implications of if this information is used in certain ways, it can be grave consequences or substantial consequences, right? I think that's what we're saying. We're saying that the community needs to enlarge, and then we have to look at this. Well, we just have to be very serious about this and look at what the implications are to the organization.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think that's been part of my disappointment with looking at sort of the IoT security space, is there are a lot of people that are breaking things and just sort of issuing guidance.
Right.
States like, hey, I broke your thing, don't build it like this, or I'll break it. And I think there's a much bigger issue behind that. And it doesn't have to do with breaking individual components or getting access to a system. I think, when you step back and you sort of look at sort of the FCC guidelines and fines that government regulators are posing, I do think you're exactly right. I think there's larger issues around, sort of privacy and consent. And I think security will sort of help to support organizations to resist those risks and sort of avoid them in the first place. But if you're designing a system without even thinking about those kinds of things, you're leaving yourself horribly exposed, because you're probably not protecting the right things and potentially not in the appropriate ways.
Right. No, and I think that takes us back to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about security by design and specifically doing a risk analysis, a risk assessment. And that's where this happens, right? It's identifying, if in thinking through these issues, then you're going to be able to identify what are the hot assets, and when we say assets in this case, is data. And therefore, there'll be implications then for protecting it. But I think it's that, it just takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, where there has to be this security by design, and specifically around that, there has to be this risk assessment. And specifically, that means there has to be a lot more people around the table talking about that risk assessment, so that, when we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we know the priorities and I guess we know the priorities.
Yeah, and there's one other thing that I really want to throw into this and that's that, there are new challenges, but I think the environment is different from traditional security environments. And so I also think solutions. that I'm not seeing a whole lot of people advance. But one of the big sort of failures in traditional information security is the lack of adoption of really complex encryption technologies. And part of the reason for that is encryption is really tricky and it's very annoying for an end user, right? It's complex.
Yeah. And most people would rather skip that and just get to the good stuff.
Right.
But
Or,
anyway,
your browser throws an error saying it's a self-signed certificate. You just click through because you're like, I have no idea.
I don't even know what the heck that is.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not a problem for a machine, right? So if you're designing an autonomous system where machines are communicating with one another, they're perfectly happy to do really complex encryption, and you can code them in such a way that they'll always follow the rule, right? They won't exercise any free will and decide they want to skip, a particular check. They'll never fall victim to, a social engineering or a phishing attack. They can resist deception. Right. So I think there are areas here where we can build stronger systems in IoT simply because it's machine-to-machine communication. And I think sectors like banking, they've done this incredibly effectively, with things like ATM and cards. They've managed to enforce very strong cryptographic protocols, even in very weak devices like cards, like credit cards. And so I think there's also an opportunity here to really look at new security solutions based on the fact that we're designing systems by and for machines.
Yeah, and I think, the weakness that we identified of there being a lack of interface can actually be the strength, is what you're saying in this case, a lack of a human interface, I should say.
Right. I mean, it's a strength and a weakness. Machines can't interrogate one another for things like security questions or your mother's maiden name or, password reset. At the same time, they can provide a password that's 2 megabytes long.
Right.
And they can do cryptographic operations on credentials that are provided to them in ways that human beings never could. So it's a trade-off for sure, but I think it's easy for people to sort of focus on the problems and the challenges in IoT and overlook the advantages of those kinds of deployments.
Yeah, good point. No, that's true. That's something I haven't thought of before. But I also don't want to lose thought, though, or lose sight of the point that this is a means to an end. Meaning, this is the executional aspect. Whether we're talking about encryption, stronger encryption. However, I think what we've uncovered in our conversation, maybe as I uncovered it for myself, and you've already had it, but was the point of this issue of having more people around the table looking at it from a risk point of view, and that's right up the alley. That's right up the alley of our listeners being managers generally. We've got lots of technicians too, but majority being managers listening to this podcast. Meaning, you've got to get your arms around this. You got to get different people on it and figure out what the policies are, what the rules are, and then your point, I like it, is that there are also some advantages. To this. And, another one I'll just throw out, I had an interesting interview a little while ago, and in the area of, it's a startup that will be producing a video on, but her point of view and their point of view is using analytics to look at network behavior. And, you brought up your PC a little while ago, and the PC is an incredibly diverse device, and it does so many different things, and you have a bunch of these diverse devices on a network, and there's so many different things that can happen. So maybe another positive thing is that if you look at it from, IoT devices are relatively not dumb, but specific. They're not doing, the endpoint specifically, the end nodes, that comprise of the network are doing pretty, specific things. So that might be another advantage, right? In the sense of, the machine-to-machine interface, awesome. And then also the type of network, the type of traffic and the type of things that are happening on the network shouldn't diverge that much. And so that might be another opportunity in our favor, right, to look at that.
Yeah, I would go a step beyond and sort of say that they're not just doing specific things, they're doing predictable things. I mean, barring the halting problem, these machines can't exercise free will. So it would be, whereas a human user will do all sorts of crazy things.
Weird things.
Have no way of predicting.
Right.
IoT deployment should behave exactly as it's programmed, which should allow you to detect anomalies right away to let you know not just about security, but also sort of about functional flaws as well. Right. But it's a bounded problem set, right? Like you don't have to worry that the user might just constantly decline the security updates and then go to 12 different disparate websites at once and download random stuff. That's
right. Right, and freak out
Right.
or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. All right. Well, with that, let's sign off on that.
Sure.
Justin, where can people find out more about you and your company? Where do you want to send people?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter. My handle is madirish2600, madirish2600.
Right.
My website is madirish.net. It hasn't been updated in a little while, and it's not IoT specific, but you can find more information. I'm on LinkedIn, and my company website, ThingWorx.com, so that's ThingWorx, has a lot of information about their product offerings and stuff, and might be a good place to start.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I'll put all this in the show analysis notes too, so people can just go on the site and just click their way through. All right, Justin. Well, that was interesting. I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Okay, that was a good talk with Justin Klein Keane. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support this show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is IoT Security Assessment, Black Hat, White Hat, or Gray with Paul Jargui. I hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Till next week, may your path to IoT business be a private one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.